Who'd have thought Nixon was going to quit? It had been all over the news that day. Richard Nixon was resigning. While Agent Grant was not at all that torn up about it, his partner and all-around new guy, Agent Cooper, did not stay quiet for a single second during the drive to the house. Grant figured that was for two reasons. First, the leader of the free world was no longer leading anything but his own way out the front door. Second, the upcoming interview was more or less irrelevant. Alexander Velez was an old guy. According to the neighbors, he had been living in his little shack house for the better part of 30 years. Harmless type. Still, they needed to cross him off the list. They had been in Arizona for the better part of a week on the trail of the Phoenix executioner, a murderer who routinely hopped state lines into California to prey on a seemingly random set of victims. Young men, old women, it did not matter. About the only thing they had in common was that all of his 15 victims were, at one point, alive. "You gotta admit," Cooper droned on. "What?" wondered Grant as he sucked away on his teeth to get rid of that one damned sesame seed. "Timing's all bad. Doesn't pass the sniff test. I mean, think about what's going on. You really think it's a good idea for him to resign?" It was at least the 30th time he had asked that question. "I'm sure I don't care right now." Cooper was not dissuaded. He continued yakety-yakking on and on regarding Nixon's resignation for another hour. There was potentially maybe a possible conspiracy. Grant thanked God when he turned the car into Velez's driveway. "We're here," he said to Cooper, "so shut up about Richard Nixon." "One last thing," Cooper buzzed. Grant nodded his head. "You think Ford was behind it?" "No, it was obviously Agnew. Now shut up and get out of the car." The shack house was more akin to a wreck house. Loose, unpainted boards, dried gray by the desert, crisscrossed each other to create a webwork of dusty splinters. A few rusted signs advertised Coca-Cola and Texaco. A mutt dog rested on a pile of dusty, worn-down clothes. He was too lazy to care anything about two strangers walking towards the front door. Grant did not like dogs. And it was hot. Surface of the sun hot. He regretted wearing his coat and tie. He figured by the time he got back to the car, he would be soaked in sweat. At least the interview was set to be a short one. They arrived at the front door, a mess of broken wood and a mostly shredded screen. Grant knocked 7 times. Soon after, Mr. Velez appeared. If Father Time had a great-great-great-great-grandfather, it was Mr. Velez. He was a crooked thing with tufts of snow-white hair atop a sun-scorched and splotchy scalp. His wrinkles within wrinkles sagged, and when he reached to open the door, Grant noticed a set of bulbous, bony, and calloused fingers at the end of a skeletal arm. Moving seemed to be quite the struggle for the old man. "Mr. Alexander Velez," said Grant as he showed his identification. "I'm Agent Grant. This is my associate, Agent Cooper. We're here to ask you a few questions." "Ah," groaned the oldest man in the world in an accent which sounded Spanish. Of course. Please come in. The door is open." "Thank you." Grant and Cooper entered the shack, but were immediately repulsed by the stench of rotting meat. Mr. Velez noticed, letting loose a cackling giggle. "I think a coyote died under the house. I'm too old to get it myself." The heat was much worse inside. Grant felt as if he had stepped into a musty pressure cooker. There was not much to the interior, no television or radio, no kitchen table, or even much of a kitchen at all. The walls were barren. Shafts of dusty light peeked through the cracks in the ceiling, but did little to alleviate the darkness. "I think I'm going to take a look around," Cooper whispered. "Something fishy here." The entire house was in plain view. "What are you looking for?" "Don't know. I'll give a shot if I find it." He then moved to the right side of the house, dragging his feet through piles of collected dirt. Grant moved towards the far side where Mr. Velez was resting on a shredded, discolored sofa. He sat awkwardly, with his bony knees pressed against each other, His hands were beneath his thighs, as if he were cold. "What do you need to ask, Mr. Grant?" wondered Velez in a deep, croaking voice. "Just a few things," he explained. "How long have you lived here?" "Longer than I can remember," he replied with an old man's giggle. "Perhaps 30 years or so. I've been here long enough to remember when this house was new." "Any family out here?" "No. I never had a family. Never needed one." "What do you do for a living?" "I was a butcher boy, meat packer, cutter, all the best jobs. Back when there was still a town." Grant nodded. It made enough sense. Might as well cut to the chase. "Mr. Velez, I'm here to ask you about a few things you might have heard about in the news. Have you ever heard of the Phoenix executioner?" "I have," replied Velez, who remained completely still. "Very scary man. Have you caught him?" "That's why I'm here. We believe he's using the back roads to get around. Have you, by any chance, seen this vehicle come by recently?" Grant produced a photograph showing the truck, a blue and white Chevy truck thought to belong to the killer. Velez glanced at the photo, but shook his head. "I do not get out much, Mr. Grant," he said. "I am so old that I do not have to be too high to see the end of the world." "Are you sure?" "Yes." With that, Grant felt his time at Alexander Velez's home had come to its end. He glanced towards his partner, who was busy pressing his shoe against a loose board in the corner. Each time he pressed, a puff of dust kicked up against his trousers. Velez cleared his throat. "Mr. Grant, will you be leaving now?" "Not quite," he said, searching for more questions to stall for his partner. "Does anyone live with you?" "No. It is only me. As I said, Mr. Grant, I live alone." "And you?" "Do you have a family?" "I do," he replied. Another peek at Cooper revealed he was still at that loose board. "It must be nice. When I was younger, I thought I should have a woman, make a family, but always trouble. I do not know if that was my fault or hers. Are you happy?" "I think so," he replied, growing more uncomfortable with the conversation with each moment. "Agent Cooper, are you ready to go?" "Just a sec," he replied before squatting at the loose board. It was then that Grant realized that Cooper was on the trail of something iffy. Although he was the new guy, he had a knack for finding angles and out-of-place things, the sort of things Grant only ever saw out of the corner of his eye. "I like you, Mr. Grant," Velez said quite suddenly. "Your friend is a little cold for me, I might say bland. But I think there is a certain sweetness to you. I like sweet." "Hey, Grant, you better come take a look," Cooper called. Grant called out, "Did you find something?" He did not want to take his eyes off Velez, not anymore. The old man had changed. No longer still, he began to rock from side to side, inches to the left, a foot to the right. And he smiled a toothy, knowing smile. Cooper pulled hard against the wood until it snapped into dozens of tiny splinters in his hands. He then stepped back, covering his face, retching with staccato coughs. "There's a cellar!" "Ah," hummed Velez. "It seems you found me." The stench reached Grant and sent him against the wall. He had smelled it before during his time in the war. Rotten human flesh. It was not like smelling a dead animal. Putrid and overwhelming. He knew there were bodies beneath the floors. Cooper pulled his sidearm. "I'm heading down." "I've got him," Grant announced, brandishing his own pistol. "Be careful and watch where you step." Velez continued his rocking. His words slurred, their meaning no longer clear. "I remember another Grant. Cary, you remind me of him. Can I keep you, Cary Grant?" "What do you have down there?" growled Grant. "Oh," Velez chuckled, rocking left and right, left and right. "I have me." A scream. It was not a normal scream, but the familiar scream of a man at the verge, the man at his end. Grant did not hesitate. He raced to the entrance of the hidden cellar, gun at the ready. Cooper's screams turned to panicked shrieks. A low, growling rumble shook the wood floor with such strength it forced Grant to the wall. And then it stopped. The agonized cries of his partner ended. All that came from the darkness was a squelching, sickly slither. And he knew something was down there. "Go down," said Velez from right next to Grant. And he had no chance. Before he could bring his gun up, the old man snatched Grant by the scruff of his neck, lifted him from the floor, and then hurled him into the dark of the cellar. He struck the ground in the dark. His hands sank into slick, warm mud. It smelled of rank iron, and he knew it was blood. The rest of the basement was near pitch dark, except for thin beams of sunlight piercing through the first floor. Shapes dangled in the shadows. All were familiar, shaped like the remains of bodies. Grant groped about the bloody, muddy floor, searching for his pistol. Though dazed, he knew he was in danger. He felt it, like the scrape of a knife against the back of his neck. But this was a different fear. It was not like the fear he felt in Vietnam. It was deeper, more visceral, the kind when prey faces down its predator.
"I do like you, Mr. Grant."
It was spoken in the same cadence as Velez. However, it sounded as if 10 people had spoken at the same time. It was horrifying. Grant was taken by his ankle and dragged through the bloody mess towards a single shaft of daylight. In all of the dust, in all of the dark, there was a darker place which moved with intent. Grant felt, in that moment, that he was not looking at the shape or shade of anything human. And whenever he tried to see better, the shade faded into inky dark, but from the corners of his eyes he could see. A great, skinless beast of many arms stood only inches away. Its face was massive, a bloodied skull with knife fangs jutting wildly from shredded and rotten gums, sending him spiraling deeper into his dizzying daze. He did not need to think much about what was coming next. He closed his eyes, whispering a prayer for God to ferry his soul to heaven. But the beast heard him and laughed a wicked, rapturous laugh that sent quakes across the ground.
"There is no heaven or hell for you, Mr. Grant. I starve. I need. You are my sweet bread to sate the hunger of another day. Be glad, for your life now finds its use."
Not once did Grant scream as the hands wrenched away whole sections of his muscle. His skin tore from his flesh, his bones bent until snapping, each sounding like a shotgun. He did not scream when the mouths chewed on his ruined flesh, or when the fingers wriggled their way into his belly. It was when the final moments came, when the beast took him into its gigantic maw, that Grant finally screamed. Wet, sticky and sickly saliva cascaded onto him, filling his mouth, burning his eyes, and deafening him. He felt the slick tissues of the tongues as they wrapped around his throat. He screamed as they pulled him down into the gullet. And in the dark, Grant let out one final cry as the beast's stomach crunched down onto him. Mr. Grant's form was agreeable, better perhaps than Velez's had been. A handsome man traveling the country would undoubtedly accomplish much more than the withered old frame of Alexander Velez. Now there were options. Arizona kept him in situ no longer. As he stepped to the front porch, he patted his dog on the head and fed him a slice of Mr. Grant's leg. The dog happily ate it all up in only a few bites. Times had changed. As well, the time had come to leave. But to where? To where the next one sees me, he said. And now he knew that his prey could, after so many centuries, see him again. And he would see them too. In time, he would take them all and again blind his prey to his presence. And then he would feast freely. He would consume daily. No human would be safe. But first, before his new hunt began and his hunger could be satisfied, he needed to get that damned sesame seed out of his teeth.